It all started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind you dream about when you live out in the country. I was sitting on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the mist rise from the hills surrounding my ranch. Birds were chirping, the horses were grazing peacefully in the distance, and everything felt calm. That was, until I saw a cloud of dust rising near the far end of my pasture. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor's truck taking the back road shortcut again. But when I got up and looked through my binoculars, I realized it was a convoy, 3 black SUVs, followed by a white van rolling up right along the old gravel path that cuts across the border of my property. That path technically ends right at my fence, but it's often mistaken as public by folks who don't know better. As they got closer, I started noticing the decals on the vehicles. One of them had a Pleasant Hills HOA Community Care Team sticker slapped on the side, and my stomach immediately sank. These weren't just weekend campers, this was the very same HOA I had clashed with more than once over the years. Pleasant Hills was a suburban community that shared a property line with the western edge of my ranch, and ever since they'd been built, the HOA had been nothing but a headache. Their president, Cheryl Lambert, whom I privately referred to as Countryside Karen, was notorious for writing long, passive-aggressive letters about my horses being too loud or my bulls posing a visual risk to children. They had once attempted to demand I put up a privacy fence because my hay bales didn't match their landscaping theme. So when I saw Cheryl herself stepping out of the lead SUV, clipboard in hand and sun visor on her head, I knew I was in for something ridiculous. I walked a little closer, staying behind my fence, and watched the scene unfold. Out came lawn chairs, picnic blankets, 2 pop-up tents, and even a couple of fishing rods. Kids ran around laughing, and a man in cargo shorts started unloading a portable grill. It hit me then, this wasn't just a casual stop. The HOA was setting up for some kind of camping event. Cheryl was directing traffic like a camp counselor, pointing people to set up near the large pond at the base of the hill. I nearly laughed out loud. That pondo, if only they knew. See, the pond looked nice from a distance. Calm, reflective, tucked beneath a cluster of old oaks. It gave the illusion of a peaceful countryside water feature, the kind you'd see on a postcard. But in reality, that pond wasn't a lake, or a fishing hole, or a swimming spot. It was a ranch waste pond. It was a ranch waste pond used exclusively by my bulls and horses to drink, roll, and relieve themselves. It had layers of waste, thick mud, horse droppings, and probably enough methane to light a small stove if you were stupid enough to spark a match near it. I'd been using that pond for livestock management for years. And just 2 days prior, one of my largest bulls had taken a long soak in it after a muddy rainfall. His contribution to the pond wasn't exactly pleasant. There were even signs posted around the perimeter. Private property, livestock use only, do not enter. They were clear, visible, and absolutely untenable. Unless, of course, you were Cheryl Lambert, the queen of entitlement. She walked right past one of those signs and set up her folding table just feet from the murkiest part of the water. I considered shouting a warning, but something told me it was better to let this play out. They hadn't asked for permission. They had made no attempt to check if the land was private or even safe. They just assumed the world was their HOA playground. I watched as one kid kicked off his shoes and ran toward the pond, chasing a frog. Another group started roasting marshmallows over a fire pit they built using twigs from my fence line. One of the adults, trying to act like a rancher, pulled out a cheap fishing rod and cast it into the water, standing proudly like he was about to catch a trophy bass. What he didn't realize was that the only thing biting in that pond were mosquitoes and bacteria. Cheryl stood near the water's edge, taking selfies and directing kids to pose with the beautiful countryside view. It was like watching a nature documentary hosted by people who had never set foot outside their gated neighborhood. I leaned against the fence, amused beyond belief. The wind was still working in their favor for now, but I knew it wouldn't last. The pond might have looked peaceful, but the second that breeze shifted direction, the truth about its contents would come rolling in like a freight train. I could already imagine the look on Cheryl's face when the smell hit her. One deep breath, and she'd know she wasn't standing next to a postcard sign, she was standing beside a bathroom for bulls. Still, they kept setting up. They rolled out yoga mats, spread out fruit trays, and one dad even tried skipping stones across the surface of the sludge. I kept thinking, surely one of them would notice the texture of the water. The unnatural brown tint, the odd smell hovering just on the edge of the air. But nope, they were too wrapped up in their fantasy of rustic living. This is so authentic, one woman squealed, holding up a mason jar of lemonade. Authentic? All right, more authentic than she'd bargained for. I considered going down there, telling them plainly what they were stepping into. But then I remembered all the times they'd complained, filed noise complaints against my cattle, and even sent me HOA violation notices despite me not even being part of their neighborhood. So I stayed where I was, watching calmly, knowing full well they were about to learn the most unforgettable ranch lesson of their lives, and the smell would be the teacher. The only thing louder than their entitlement was the silence of their ignorance. and it was about to be broken by a very loud, very smelly reality check. It didn't take long, maybe 15 minutes at most, before everything started to go south. From where I stood leaning on the fence, I could see the kids playing near the water's edge, tossing rocks, poking sticks into the murky surface, completely unaware of the horror show brewing just inches beneath the surface. One of the men had dragged a folding chair right up to the edge and was trying to cast a fishing line, as if a pond full of livestock waste was going to reward him with a prize-winning bass. Some of the women were laying out a picnic on a tarp, laughing, joking, talking about how peaceful and quiet it was. Cheryl stood in the middle of it all like a queen overseeing her little camping kingdom, proudly snapping selfies with the pond behind her, adding hashtags like #NatureVibes and #CountryEscape. On her HOA Instagram page, it was almost too perfect, too clueless. But then the wind shifted. Just slightly at first. A soft breeze rolled across the field and crept down the hill toward the pond. And with it came the most ungodly stench you could ever imagine. The odor hit the camp like a silent bomb, thick, sour, wet, and unmistakably organic. A combination of cow pies, soaked hay, rotting pond algae, and the kind of ammonia-rich horse waste that could knock a grown man flat. The transformation was instant. A few people twitched. One woman paused mid-bite into a sandwich, blinked, sniffed, then gagged. A child covered his nose and shouted, "Eat-boo, what's that smell?" Then came the panic. The man fishing leaped to his feet, dropping the rod and stumbling backward. The line flung brown slime into the air, spraying two kids who began crying. Almost immediately, a teenage girl squealed as she looked down at her feet and realized she was standing in a puddle of green-brown muck, thick enough to stick her sandals in place like glue. One of the younger boys had ventured a little too far into the water and suddenly let out a blood-curdling scream. "Something touched me," he cried. "It's moving. It's in the water." He tried to run back but slipped, landing squarely on his back in a wet, squishy splash of God knows what. The screams got louder. People were slipping, yelling, gagging, waving their arms as if swatting invisible flies. One mom shouted, "Get away from the water! Get away from the water!" Another dad tripped over a cooler and went face first into the picnic spread. I watched the chaos with a mix of amusement and disbelief. They had walked onto private land, ignored every posted sign, and now they were rolling in the consequences literally. The picnic blankets were soaked in filth. The yoga mats were ruined, and the fire pit they'd built was now surrounded by used wet wipes and stomped fruit. Cheryl was spinning in circles, barking orders, trying to maintain control. "It's just a smell," she yelled. "It's just a little country odor. Everyone calm down." But no one was listening. One woman was nearly in tears trying to scrub her child's shoes with a napkin. A man was cursing while pouring bottled water on his legs, trying to get the brown sludge off his skin. Then came the dramatic moment that sealed the whole disaster. One of the teenage girls, shrieking and stomping in place, yanked her phone out of the pond water and held it high, coated in greenish muck. My phone is dead." She screamed like the world was ending. Cheryl finally locked eyes with me across the fence. Her face was red, her mouth open, and her expression a mix of shock and rage. She stomped toward me, furious. "You knew," she shouted from across the property line. "You knew this pond was disgusting, and you let us set up here anyway." I raised an eyebrow and shrugged. I figured the signs would do the talking. Or maybe the smell. "You should have stopped us," she snapped. "This is dangerous. There are children here, and those children were trespassing." I said calmly, "This is private property. That pond is for livestock. It's not for your cookouts. You'll be hearing from our attorney," she said, her voice shaking with frustration. "I'm going to report this entire thing to the county. This is a health hazard. Feel free," I replied. "The county already knows. I file my waste management report every spring. That pond is perfectly legal for ranch use. And you ignored the big red signs." Her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to say more, but she was interrupted by another kid, screaming, "Mom, it's in my hair," followed by gagging noises. Cheryl turned and ran back to clean up the mess, but by then, it was too late. The exodus had begun. They started packing in panic mode. Chairs were yanked up and thrown into trunks, half-taken down tents were shoved into bags, and the trash was left behind. A man gave up trying to clean off his cooler and just tossed it into the back of his SUV. Pond water still dripping from it. Nobody spoke to each other. They were too busy avoiding eye contact, trying not to vomit, and praying that whatever touched them wasn't alive. Within 20 minutes, the camp was dismantled. The once cheerful, picture-perfect picnic site looked like a disaster zone. Blankets crumpled and stained. Shoes stuck in the mud. A single broken lawn chair stood abandoned at the edge of the pond like a war monument. They drove off one by one, some still wiping their hands with disinfectant wipes, others rolling down their windows to get a breath of air as they escaped the ranch. And there I stood, arms crossed, watching them disappear over the hill, the wind carrying just a faint trace of the unforgettable scent they'd tried so hard to ignore. Ranch life had introduced itself, and it didn't come with a warning label. They wanted the countryside experience, they got it. Just not the kind they could filter or hashtag, and I had a feeling they'd never forget it. By the time the last SUV disappeared over the ridge, the chaos they'd left behind looked like a battlefield that had been overrun by panic, mud, and failure. All that remained around the pond was trampled grass, overturned chairs, a few empty soda cans, and a smell so thick you could still taste it in the air. I stood at my fence, arms crossed, soaking in the silence as the sun dipped behind the hills. Their great HOA family day in the country had ended in screams, filth, and tears. I figured that would be the end of it, that maybe, just maybe, they'd learned their lesson. But I underestimated Cheryl Lambert. The next morning, at exactly 9:05 a.m., I received an email that nearly made me choke on my coffee. It came from Cheryl's official HOA email account. Subject line, in bold, formal liability notice, hazardous conditions and damages. I clicked it open and couldn't believe what I was reading. Cheryl had written a full complaint claiming that my unkempt waste reservoir, as she called the pond, was a threat to public health, and that I had knowingly allowed children and families to come into contact with toxic livestock by. She said her husband had experienced minor respiratory distress. One child had developed a rash, and 2 residents had allegedly needed emotional decompression time due to their exposure to unidentified biological substances. The best part? She demanded nearly $4,800 in damages. She had itemized the cost of ruined clothes, 2 camping tents, a lost iPhone, and 1 deluxe memory foam camp mattress. She wanted reimbursement plus a gesture of goodwill in the form of an apology and a paid HOA community barbecue. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. Rather than answer her directly, I forwarded the email to my lawyer, Dave Perkins. Dave had been handling my ranch contracts for over a decade, a straight-shooting country lawyer who once got a trespassing fine dismissed by showing the judge a muddy boot print and a barbed wire scar. Dave called me not 10 minutes after I sent him the email, already chuckling. "Bill," he said, "you didn't tell me your pond was a national disaster zone, only for city folk who can't read signs." I said, "Do you want to handle it with pleasure?" Dave drafted a response that was so sharp and dry it should have come with a warning label. In it, he made it clear that the HOA group had trespassed onto clearly marked private land, ignored posted signage, exposed themselves willingly to livestock environments, and that their complaint was not only frivolous but borderline harassment. He warned them that if they pursued legal action, we would countersue for trespassing, damage to property, and public defamation. He attached photos of the signs, time-stamped drone images of their campsite, and even a copy of the last county inspection, which listed my pond as being in full compliance with ranch waste regulations. We never got a reply. Cheryl went quiet, but she didn't stop. Instead of apologizing or backing off, she switched tactics. She had a new sign posted at the end of the HOA nature trail, the part closest to my fence. In bold red letters, it read, "Warning, dangerous conditions beyond this point. Adjacent private property maintained poorly. Do not proceed." I almost laughed again when I saw it. So now, I was the villain. The dangerous neighbor, the unclean country savage who let children fall into manure lakes. I could have taken that as defamation and filed a formal complaint, but I didn't, because honestly, that sign did me a favor. Nobody from Pleasant Hills came near my land again. No more nature walks peeking into my pasture. No more HOA newsletters talking about shared scenery responsibilities. The entire neighborhood avoided the fence like it was an electric barrier. What they didn't know, though, was that their own residents were turning on Cheryl. A week or so later, I got a visit from Alan, one of the more level-headed HOA board members. He pulled up in an old Ford truck, stepped out in jeans and a collared shirt, and gave me a nod as he walked to the fence. "You got a minute?" he asked. "Sure," I said, expecting some kind of warning or attempt at mediation. Instead, he surprised me. "I just came to apologize," he said, "not officially, just personally." I raised an eyebrow. "You weren't even the one covered in pond slime." "No," he laughed, "but I was in the meeting when Cheryl pushed this whole idea. I told them it was a bad call, that it was probably private land, but nobody listens when Cheryl's got her mind made up. After what happened, well, let's just say a few people on the board are questioning her leadership." He reached into his shirt pocket and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten card that said, "Sincere apologies from several of us. We respect your land and your way of life. Please accept this as a token of goodwill." It was signed by 4 HOA board members and contained a $100 gift card to the local ranch supply store. I was honestly touched. I shook Alan's hand and told him no hard feelings. He promised to discourage anyone from ever trying anything like this again. After that day, the HOA completely backed off. No more complaints, no more visits, no more signs, except the one warning people to stay away. Cheryl, well, rumor had it she was asked to step down as HOA president not long after the pond incident. Apparently, the embarrassment, the photos, and the neighborhood backlash finally caught up to her. One image in particular of her covered in slime, yelling at her husband while a crying child stood beside her ended up on a local Facebook meme page with the caption, "Karen and the Cattle Pond Chronicles." It went semi-viral. Even folks from town started calling my pond lake HOA. The best part was when someone printed the meme and taped it to the bulletin board at the feed store. Every time I saw it, I smiled a little bigger. Nowadays, things have gone back to normal. My animals roam free. The pond does what it's meant to do. The HOA minds their own business, and my property line has never been more respected. Sometimes, I'll walk past that same pond and pause, looking out over the water. The smell's still there, strong as ever, but now it carries a sweet memory, a reminder that arrogance and ignorance always find their own punishment out here. The city folk came out chasing a dream. They thought country life meant pretty trees and clean air, but forgot that it also includes dirt, dung, and the reality of ranching. Out here, we don't post fake fences and fuss about lawn heights. We build real fences, grow real food, and deal with real nature. And if someone forgets where they are, the land reminds them. With every squelch, every stink, and every stain, that won't come out of their overpriced hiking pants. Lesson learned. Don't trespass where bulls bathe. And don't mess with ranchers who've got the patience to let the land do the talking for them.